I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you about the income tax. Did you know that almost half of Americans don't pay any income tax? In fact, a lot of them get refunds. For it's not just a refund; they get money for credits, and they never even paid any income tax in the first place. But the other half pay a lot, and some people pay a whole lot. Between the federal government and the states, a lot of states have income taxes that are based on the amount of income they have for federal income tax purposes. So that gets added on. Anyway, most people don't have a very high view of the IRS. But really, the IRS are just bureaucrats doing what they're told to do. If you dislike the income tax, the people you really should detest are past Congresses. In fact, all the really horrible stuff that's in the Internal Revenue Code was in there from the very day they first started imposing it in 1913 after the passage of the 16th Amendment. Yes, they tricked American citizens into voting to ratify a constitutional amendment because they had to. The income tax was unconstitutional before the 16th Amendment. I won't get into the technical reasons why, but it very clearly was, and that's why they ratified the 16th Amendment. And they told people, oh, it's only going to be a 1% tax and it's only going to be on the rich. Does that sound familiar? Anyway, that's how it started. It was a 1% tax, and it was only on people who made a lot of money. And almost right off the bat, they started raising it. Of course, we were in World War I. And they had to pass the income tax because at the same time they were doing that, they were also getting rid of alcohol. They had imposing alcohol prohibition. These are the great ideas of the progressives, which is the American word for Marxists. They call themselves progressives because it would be very bad marketing for themselves if they called themselves Marxists. Some modern progressives admit that they're socialists. Bernie Sanders, AOC. They admit it. They give them credit. They tell the truth. They are socialists, which means they're Marxists. There's no different. Marx was just a propagandist for the socialists, and he spelled it all out, what they wanted. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. That's the way they described it, meaning that the government gets to take everything from each as it sees fit, and then give it out the way that bureaucrats and politicians see fit. That's what that really is. That they believe that you don't really own your own property. You don't really own your own income. It's really the government's. Anything you get to keep is just because they let you keep it. And in fact, one of the specific demands by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto was for a graduated income tax, just like we have now. That's where they got the idea. Although Louis XIV had imposed an income tax just by royal fiat on the peasants. Only in pre-revolutionary France, one of the things about being a peasant was you were the only one who had to pay taxes. If you were a nobleman in France, you didn't have to pay taxes. And the income tax was considered so humiliating and degrading that only peasants had to pay it. That's the way it worked in pre-revolutionary France. And they were the first ones who did it. The British didn't have an income tax until very briefly during the Napoleonic Wars, and they got rid of it right away. They needed it because Napoleon was threatening to take over Britain. Anyway, the idea of an income tax is pretty hideous, and if you've ever had a tax audit, you've seen how unpleasant it could be. And the IRS has all kinds of powers to collect the tax. Your employer is forced to withhold your income. What that is, that was in there from day one. In 1913, when they ratified it, they had the whole income tax ready to go because they copied it from Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany's income tax. They had this authoritarian kingdom in Germany. They had an income tax, and that's what they copied. And there are two sets of provisions in the income tax law that have been in there completely unchanged. Everything else has been changed a million times. But there's two sets of provisions that have been in there from day one. The employer withholding stuff, where they take your money when when you get your salary, when you get your paycheck, you only get part of it. They get the rest. They take it out. They treat you. And by the way, in the normal situation involving creditors and debtors, the only way a creditor can take your income before you've gotten paid is if they get a judgment against you. And then even the judgment alone isn't enough. They have to go back and get another court order after they've done an asset hearing against you and humiliated you in an asset hearing. And then they get another court order having the court order your employer to, it's called garnishment, garnish your paycheck. The IRS gets that automatically just because you're an employee. And if you're an employer, you have you absolutely have to do that. They don't pay you to do it. You're basically, the employers are uncollected, uncompensated employees who don't get paid, uncompensated agents of the income tax. They have to collect it out of your tax or out of the income that they otherwise would pay to you. It's called garnishment in normal life, and they get it automatically just because they are who they are. And you're just an employee in their mind. So they get to treat you like dirt, like a peasant in old France before the revolution. That's exactly the way they view you. And anyway, all that employer withholding stuff has been in there from day one, unchanged. Those are practically the only statutes in the whole thing that have never been changed. And by the way, they didn't even enforce them until 1942. Most people didn't even know that stuff was in there in the Internal Revenue Code. They didn't tell people. That they knew that Americans would absolutely go insane if they knew that their money was going to get taken before they got it from their employer that way. Because they're being treated like judgment creditors who don't pay their bills, or judgment debtors who don't pay their judgment. That's what they do to everybody because they're an employee. They garnish your paycheck. Anyway, they didn't enforce it until World War II, when they thought people's patriotism had gotten sufficiently riled up that they'd tolerate that. They have a very fine antenna about what they can get away with politically. Anyway, all that employer withholding stuff has been in there from day one, and so has another bunch of statutes. All the crimes, all the tax crimes where they can prosecute you for tax evasion, whatever that is. What is tax evasion? Who doesn't want to evade taxes? Anyway, that's in there. There's a whole bunch of tax crimes, and basically the slightest, I represent people who are being accused of this by the IRS, and boy, it is really scary when it happens for those people. Anyway, and just the investigation by the Criminal Investigation Division, that alone is a nightmare. If they get indicted, it's just icing on the cake. And if they get indicted and they get acquitted, it's a Pyrrhic victory. Their life is already ruined. They've spent a fortune in legal fees. They've been humiliated in public. The whole thing is horrible. And the way the tax crimes are described, because remember, they got these from Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, the slightest deviation from perfect conformity with the tax law becomes a crime if you do it willfully, whatever that means. So they made it real easy for the government to go after you for tax crimes. All that stuff's been in there from day one. And they really didn't enforce the crimes much until the 1970s. That's when they started doing it a lot. Although they really only indict about 1,000 people a year. But they terrify everyone because the way they choose people to indict is not based on how bad they are. It's based on whether they think the person is a model citizen otherwise. That's how they pick most of the people. It's all selective prosecution. And what they do is they look for somebody where everybody else in the community, if they heard that person was indicted, said, oh my God, they indicted that guy? Boy, I'm going to do my tax return and pay my taxes to the penny. That's where the whole thing is terrorism of the citizens. Anyway, the IRS has all these powers that no other creditor has, and none of that is constitutional. The 16th Amendment doesn't have any special language in it, giving the IRS the power to do anything other than what an ordinary creditor can do. And we know that that's what the way the Constitution was written and how it was intended, that the IRS have no power that isn't specifically granted to it in the Constitution. That's exactly what the 9th and 10th Amendments say. That if it isn't given to the IRS, they can't do it. Or it isn't given to the federal government, they can't do it. And the amendments which immediately preceded the 16th Amendment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, each of those have an entire paragraph that says Congress shall have whatever power it needs to enforce this. That's not in the 16th Amendment. And basically, if you ask the IRS, well, where do you get all this power from? They'll say, well, it's the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. Except if it's necessary and proper for them to collect the money by doing all these horrible things to you that no other creditor can do, why isn't it necessary and proper for any other creditor? And creditors are allowed to use the courts. Anyway, the reality is there's two lines of authority that the courts have relied on to give the IRS all this extra power. And both of them are absolutely worthless lines. One of them, there's a case from 1878, U.S. v. Thompson. And that one says that the government, when it wants to collect taxes, succeeded to the powers of the king at Yorktown. That even though the rest of the government was not supposed to be like the king, that's why we had the revolution, the IRS gets to have the powers of the king. And the king, there's no limit on his power to collect taxes. I'm not kidding. This is what the courts have used to justify it. And Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist 81 said specifically that the federal government did not succeed to the powers of the king, that the sovereign power went to the states. And he says in the Federalist 81, it would only go to the federal government as well if the states gave it, and the states never gave it. So that whole line of authority is wrong. The other line of authority is based on the Interstate Commerce Clause. And I have shown in other videos why that clause doesn't mean anything like what the federal government has been claiming it means. And it does not authorize any of the power that they've been claiming for all these administrative agencies. And that was confirmed in a Supreme Court opinion, Gibbons v. Ogden. And it was also confirmed in memoranda written by Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson to President Washington when he asked about whether the government had the power to own 20% of the stock in a Bank of the United States, which would just compete with other banks. It wasn't like the Fed. It didn't have any special power, couldn't regulate other banks, and all it would do would be just like other banks. It would issue money based on, it would be backed by gold. It wasn't allowed to do anything special that other banks couldn't do. Thomas Jefferson said that was totally unconstitutional, didn't even mention the Commerce Clause. Alexander Hamilton said that was constitutional, just that it took it to the limit, but that was constitutional, but not based on the Commerce Clause. It was based on the Necessary and Proper Clause, and I just told you why the Necessary and Proper Clause cannot justify all that power that the IRS claims to have and that they've been given by Congress. Don't blame the IRS. They're just bureaucrats doing their job. It was Congress and the president, and it happened in 1913. We are living under the tyranny of Woodrow Wilson and the Democrat Congress that he had at that time, who put that all in there, and it's never been changed because it can't be repealed because of the filibuster. And I've done numerous videos about that. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, please watch what I have to say in my videos and let other people know about me.